Thank you so much, and I think there will be a lot of questions that you will have to ask afterwards. But without too much delay, can I now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kehinde Andrews. He's a senior lecturer in sociology at Birmingham City University and has published work on race, racism and ethnicity, and is also the founding director of the new Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham, and he's a senior fellow of the Yale University Urban Ethnography Project. Could you please welcome Dr. Andrews?
Hello, thank you. That's loud, isn't it? Wow. All right. Thank you for the invite. I just want to say hello to everybody. My work is largely about race, racism, ethnicity. I've also had, for a number of reasons, which I will get to in the talk, quite a lot of experience doing health research in America, in the United Kingdom. My first job after my PhD was actually doing health research in Birmingham, and there's a reason for that which I will come to. What I want to talk about a little bit today is why race equality matters, but I think you know why it matters, what it means to have race equality, and also how do we get it. I'm going to put a caveat on this as well to say that Malcolm X is the inspiration behind my work. I've dubbed this year, with some of the work that we're doing in the community, Year X. This is 50 years since Malcolm X was assassinated, 90 years since he was born. And Malcolm had a saying which I basically used as a motto for this year, which is make it plain. Sometimes you've got to say stuff and you just got to say it real, and it's hard truths to hear, but it's the reality. So I'm going to try and do that a little bit today. And I want to start by thanking the other speakers, and also it gives the context of what I'm talking about here. We've heard that internal equality, in terms of workforce equality in the NHS, is pretty terrible. We've also heard that external equality, in terms of health inequalities, what's being delivered and how people are experiencing health in our communities, is also pretty terrible too, right? So there's significant challenges which face us in the healthcare service, in health in general, in public health, but I want to try and connect these more broadly to looking at other forms of inequality, right? The way that health works, the way that this internal and external inequality in NHS works and healthcare works, it is connected into other forms. If you want a simple explanation for why you have these inequalities, that simple explanation is racism, and you'll find that across other places. All right. So I'm going to skip to the first slide, and again, I don't want to spend too much on this because I'm pretty sure that you're aware of this. Why does race equality matter? Why does it specifically matter in the NHS? 1 in 6 members of the workforce in NHS are black and minority ethnic. That's 37% of doctors and 20% of nurses. So in terms of the frontline staff, frontline delivery, there's a large proportion of it is done by black and minority ethnic workers. This has an impact, obviously, staff well-being. Actually, one of the reasons you'll find that this has become race is back on the agenda is because of this word you'll hear, productivity. If staff are unhappy, they're unproductive. And if you look at the reports, look at the language about this, it's about how do we make this 37% of doctors, 20% of nurses happier so they can be more productive, and maybe we can make some of these efficiency savings. There's an economic argument to it. That also connects into service delivery. What happens if your frontline staff are unhappy? That means the service delivery is poorer. In the age of competition, ranking, etc., these things become more and more and more important, right? But there's two also important reasons as well. If you look at commissioning, the way that the new setup is for the NHS presides me with absolute terror and fear in how these things, inequalities, are going to get better or they're going to get worse. Professor Fenton mentioned some of the positives of moving out public health into local councils. And that potentially that makes sense, but in reality, when you look at the cuts that were made to local councils, particularly in local councils where we are likely to live, you will find that this actually presents lots and lots of problems. So I'm from Birmingham City Council. Birmingham City Council is broke and isn't run very well, right? The idea that Birmingham City Council has the public health agenda for the whole of the city, I can't fathom it. But that's on a Birmingham basis. Yeah? And as I was saying before, in my first job after my PhD, I was actually employed by the PCT. Where the way that the PCTs work, the primary care trust worked, is there was a primary care trust for the heart of Birmingham, which is about 80% black and minority ethnic. And that primary care trust decided what the services were, decided what the research was, and I was specifically employed to look at asthma, because asthma was hugely prevalent in this community, and try to work out ways to deal with that in this particular area. With the ways that commissioning is broken up, with the ways that public health is broken up, I don't think you will see that kind of very local, very focused on our issues. I don't think you'll see that as much. I could be wrong, but that's a potential problem. Also, Professor Fenton's done lots and lots of work on researching black minority ethnic groups, but you'll be surprised there's a paucity of that research, particularly a paucity around African and Caribbean communities. My wife is currently just about to finish her PhD looking at this issue, and you'll find that the research base is pretty poor. And so we have to make sure that when we're talking about equality, we're talking about equality about all these things. Not just about in the workforce, it's also about what the service does, what the research is behind the service as well. Now, thinking about the context of this, we have the new standard which has come out, and this is welcome, obviously. It's always welcome to have these things. But we have to understand that we've brought a lot of faith, generally, within healthcare, within other things, education, in legislation. Yeah? But what you need to understand about Britain is we have some of the most proactive, beautifully written, positive race equality legislation in the world. The Race Relations Amendment Act in 2000 states that not only does the public bodies have to not be racist, they have to actively promote non-racism. Yeah? They have to actively take into account when making decisions whether this decision is racist or not. You won't find that law in many places. That's a very, very important law and duty which is placed on the NHS and other services. However, after 14 years, this is probably the worst applied and policed piece of legislation on the British statute books. How many times do you think hospitals, universities, schools really take proper account of these race equality duties and really do them? If they were taking account of their race equality duties, you wouldn't need a standard around the workforce 14 years after the delivery of the Race Relations Amendment Act. Not to mention the Race Relations Act, which actually outlawed discrimination, the kind of discrimination we're still facing, that was in 1978. So what does it mean then when the policy's there, but it doesn't get implemented? What does it mean when the policy's there, but 14 years later you're still having to go back and try and reinvent the wheel? What that means is that we have to stop looking at legislation as being the solution and start looking at legislation as being, it's nice, but it's like a dressing, it's like salad. And if you only eat salad for dinner, you're going to be hungry, right? And that is how we need to start understanding how this policy and this legislation and these kind of practices work. There's a quote here, I'm going to bring a bit of theory and not too much. Critical race theory, which is American theory, which is drawn from legal scholars in the United States who looked at the civil rights movement. These are lawyers who are involved in the civil rights movement, who are involved in some of the big key passages of legislation. And they were there at the time, they were writing about it, they were working about it, they were campaigning about it. And what they realized after all this legislation had been passed, they realized that actually things hadn't really improved, right? So, for instance, in America, you have desegregation of the schools in the 50s, but now you actually find the schools are more segregated than they were before the legislation. You find that you've got lots of things about voting rights. Those have now been repealed. And in America, you also have this huge problem with mass incarceration. It's a problem in the UK, but not to the same amount of numbers. Yeah? So these theorists who were writing and scholars and lawyers came to the conclusion that actually you can't put that much faith in the legislation. And there's a quote from Derek Bell, who I always use this quote, and he says, "What we designate as racial progress is not a solution to that problem. It is a regeneration of the problem in a particularly perverse form." So if you have a legislation that's passed, it gives the government cover to say we've passed this legislation, we are dealing with the issue, but then in reality the issue is still there and it's less likely to be dealt with in the future. I would argue that is very, very much the case with race relations legislation in the United Kingdom, which is on the books but is almost meaningless. So in terms of the NHS standard, it's welcome, and I always say it's welcome, but I would warn you to be careful. It on its own is basically irrelevant. If you look at what the standard does, it says we need to monitor things at the top level, perceptions of staff, and monodisciplinaries. The question is, and this I completely agree with Vivian on this, is what do you do with that? Once that information is out there, what do you do? Who's going to be the ones that police it and say, well, actually, look at this NHS, all these NHS trusts, which are clearly not living up to the race equality duty. Who's going to make sure that they do? And the only people who are going to make sure that they do is you. It's not going to be the government, it's not going to be the state, it's not going to be anybody else, it's going to be you. It's going to be the BME networks locally and nationally who are going to have to put pressure on the local trust and on the national trust to change things. Because without that, I guarantee you, nothing will change, and we'll still be having the same conversation in 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years. All right. I also want to broaden the context out a little bit and say that this problem of equality, particularly the problem of equality in terms of workplace and representation, is not just a problem for the NHS. I work in a university, academic. I'm just about to write a paper about this, and you'll probably be surprised to know, I was surprised to know, there's less than 10 black, and when I say black, I mean Caribbean, African, less than 10 who are employed in the United Kingdom who are a lecturer, senior lecturer, or professor in sociology. Less than 10. 3 of us work in my university, right? That's how bad it is. University is terrible, awful. 1.2% of academic staff are black British. 85 out of 14,000 professors, much less likely to work in public institutions. And there is one, I found one the other day, one black professor of sociology in the United Kingdom. All right? It's terrible. If you think NHS is bad, the universities are also equally terrible. So when we think about why do these things happen in the NHS and how do we get race equality in the NHS, we have to broaden this out and say, well, how do we get race equality further? This is a battle which impacts you. It's also a battle which impacts us as well. So what you found with the changes that we've had over the last 50 years, and we had our own civil rights movement in Britain. It doesn't get the same level of credibility and noise that the American one does, but we did have a civil rights movement. And what you find similarly in the States is that there's been some access to stuff, but it's very, very contingent and it's very, very, very limited. So for example, 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have got the job I had now. As I was saying to you before, I ended up as this kind of circuitous route to get into to my actual work of study, because there's more money in health, there's more money in education, there's more jobs there, and you can finally eventually work your way into academia. But 15 years ago, I probably don't have the job I have now, right? So but that's probably the only change which has happened in terms of access. Some of us have been lucky enough to get in, and the question then is, and the question about race equality is, do we need to look and redefine what do we mean by racial equality, right? So this is one of my bugbears generally with a lot of the way that we talk about equality. Generally speaking, not just in the health service, but across the board, is that we equate representation with equality, right? So if you look at what we've tried to do, is we've tried to say, well, if you get black people into the police, if you get black people into the universities, into the health service, then by our nature of being black, we will transform it, we will make it better, we will make it fairer, and we will make it more equal. Unfortunately, I would say there's very little evidence that that is the case. Unfortunately, what we have found, and Vivian touched on this earlier actually, is that when people have got in, not all the time, I won't say it's all the time, but when some people have got in, they have taken the approach of very individualistic, pulled the ladder up for other people, and have not transformed it, and not transformed the organisation. And there is a reason why I have Trevor Phillips up here, because I think Trevor Phillips kind of embodies this kind of idea of what we don't want to see with representation. Trevor Phillips was very high up in terms of representation, one of the best paid public servants, very close to the Labour government, and what did he use that power to make things better, or did he use that power to self-aggrandize? And anybody saw the last TV show he did, if anybody saw the expose in the Daily Mail, I think that was his final and official exit from the black community. But that is what I will say. So, drawing on my inspiration for the year, as I said, Malcolm X, so I can make this plain a little bit, right? So, Malcolm X talks about the idea of the house Negro and the field Negro. And I want to use, this metaphor is really, really important. I mean, it's a bit loaded and a bit emotionally charged, but it's quite an important metaphor. Because what he's saying is on the plantation, there were black people who were taken in more. House Negro still discriminated against. House Negro still a slave. House Negro still getting racism. But because of the differential racism of that, because of not catching the lash in the field, because of being inside the house and having somewhat better conditions, this mentality can emerge, Malcolm's saying, where the house Negro becomes more like the master than the master himself. Yeah? And we have to remember that. And we have to hold that true and say, well, actually, does that happen and do we see that? And I can honestly say in academia, there's been lots of black people in the past who have come in and have made waves and have done that exact same mentality. Close the drawbridge, not let anybody, not changed it and not made it any better. We have to remember that a plantation is still a plantation, even if everybody is black who owns the plantation, right? And that is very important and fundamental. So we're talking about racial equality, we have to be talking not just about getting black faces in, but when we are in, it is incumbent upon us to transform stuff. We have to understand that the institutions are racist, it is not the individuals in the institutions who are racist. So you can be black, police officer, nurse, teacher, and be equally an advocate of racism as a white one. In fact, if anybody's been pulled over by a black police officer, you'll realize that race does not make you any less racist necessarily. All right, so coming to institutional racism is a term that is used a lot, but not necessarily understood particularly well. Institutional racism, after Macpherson, the idea that we want to change and transform things, if you actually look at what institutional racism is defined as in the United Kingdom, it's very, very much about individuals. It's about, well, how do we get more black police officers, more black teachers? How do we train those people who are racist to not be racist anymore? And then that in itself will change the institution. That is not what is meant by institutional racism. The term institutional racism arises from the Black Power movement, Stokely Carmichael and Charles Hamilton, who wrote the book Black Power, very, very important, influential book. And when they define institutional racism, this is the quote I like to use. It's a bit lengthy, I'm going to skip a bit through it. The first bit is saying that when white terrorists bomb a church, that's individual racism. That's not institutional racism, that's individual racism. But when in the same city, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities, and thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, intellectually because of conditions of poverty and discrimination in the black community, that is institutional racism. So the fact that you have these huge disparities that Professor Fenton mentioned in terms of even maternity care, your child is more likely to die if your child is more likely to die before the age of 5 if you are in certain ethnic minorities. Like, the list is there, right? It's terrible. The fact that these things still happen, that is institutional racism. And the question is, how do we transform the society, which includes the health service, to make sure these things don't happen? Because at the minute, we don't do a very good job, and we have to be honest about that, and honest about how we address that. In the university sector, what does that mean? For us, that has meant Black Studies. So I started the Black Studies Association. One of the reasons is to try to get more black people in. Certainly, there's a representational issue. If as a lecturer of sociology, if I leave my job, the chances of another black person taking my job is very, very unlikely. If we have Black Studies, just pragmatically, the chance of somebody placing me will be black and much higher. So there's an issue of representation. But there's a bigger issue, actually, is about saying, how do we change what the university does? For me, the university doesn't work very well. For me, the university is too elitist, it's too separate. So in terms of Black Studies, what we're trying to actually do is say it's more important that we transform what the function of university is and the knowledge that is produced. So the black experience becomes center of what happens in the university and is much more engaged in connection and connection to the community and to activism. So the idea is we can create a different kind of university knowledge. It creates a much more, a better institution in terms, a less racist institution in terms of doing it. There's problems with that, but let's just say it's positive at the minute. Health is also part of this. Health studies, health research has been a big part of Black Studies. Obviously, the NHS has always employed a lot of us, right? It's been one of the places where my grandmother first got a job in the NHS. I've worked in the NHS. If you're black, you've got a family member at least who's worked in the NHS, right? So it's a fact. So health is hugely important, and health is also important because in terms of how we experience racism, health, all those health inequalities, probably the most vivid example is mental health. If you look at how overrepresented we are in mental health, you realize that racism actually affects you emotionally, actually affects you mentally, right? Living in this experience. So how do we do that with health? How do we make health research much more connected, much more active? There's a term which I use in health research that our communities are hard to reach. That's not really true. We just don't try and reach them. Yeah? So how do we make sure that the research can go out there and reach? So in NHS, that's a challenge I would give to you, is how do you reshape the service so it better serves minority ethnic communities? And I would say that particularly given the changes that's happening, the fragmentation, the commissioning, these creates really significant problems for how we're going forward. Things are quite bad now, and we have to make sure they get better, they don't get worse. So that would be my challenge for the external race equality as well as internal race equality. As I said, I was going to make it plain a little bit. My wife said, you shouldn't put this slide up. Take this slide out. It's too much. I said, no, we're going to put it in, right? Because this is really important in terms of understanding how change happens. Back to Derek Bell again and the idea of critical race theory. Central to what the critical race theorists are arguing is that it doesn't matter if you're on the morally right, if you're legally right, if you've got the legislation. As black people, we've been on the right side of the argument for 500 years. Sadly, we've been on the wrong side of the outcomes for 500 years too. So what this quote is saying is actually it's not about being rational, about being right. It's about power. Yeah? And when you look at the changes that have happened and the limited change which have happened across the years, both in the United States here, across the world, the interests of blacks in receiving racial justice will be accommodated only when it converges with the interests of whites. It only happens when it is in the interest of the majority that anything happens positively for us. That is just how it works. And if you look at the language around the NHS standard, you can see that very clearly. It's the economic benefits. It's the benefits to patients. It's the benefits to service deliveries. The fact that you have 1 in 6 staff and more than 1 in 5 frontline delivery services. You have to do it because it can save money and it can make the service better for everybody, right? Those economic arguments in terms of making sure this happens are really, really important. But also, I think we have generally, and not just particularly the NHS, but generally speaking, we've given far too much faith as communities to the system, to the schools, to the university, to the health service, to the police, to change because of this rational, moral, legal, because it's right. That doesn't happen. What we have to do is we have to mobilize our power much, much more strongly. When you represent 1 in 6 of the workforce of an organization, you have huge amounts of power to change and transform that organization. What it means that we have to organise. That's why Vivian is correct about the local organisation, the national organisation, collectively come together and make sure that when these things are monitored and you find out it's terrible, because we know it's terrible, there has to be accountability and there has to be change. The only people that can make that accountability is yourselves. And we have to be thinking more outside the box of how we do that. So I am going to end then with a quote from Frederick Douglass, who says that power concedes nothing without a demand. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And you have to be much more, and it's not just in the NHS, but across the board. We have to connect our struggles together. We have to be much more confident about making these demands, because honestly, we have the power. 1 in 6 people of the workforce, you have the power to do this. You have to do this. It's very important for the future and how we go forward. Thank you.